Nice touch. Are we ready? Oh.
I'm ready when you are.
Oh.
Is it running? Okay.
Well, my name is Bob Fleming. I was born in Burlington in 1931. My parents were Robert Fleming and Mary Finnegan Fleming. And they had, let's see how many, 4 boys. I was the oldest, and 1 girl. And anyway, so I was raised in this town, and as I say, I'm 4th generation. Michael Fleming was the first Fleming to arrive here. They tell me he came over from Ireland and landed in the New England area someplace. And he evidently couldn't find work, or I don't know what the deal was, but they say he took a boat around and ended up in New Orleans. And he was a cooper by trade. And he ended up coming up the Mississippi River. And now why he stopped in Burlington, I don't know, but he did. And he had met a nice young woman in New Orleans, so he liked Burlington. He turned around and went down and married her and brought her up to Burlington. So he was a cooper here in Burlington. And then in later years, he had a grocery store down on Jefferson Street. And I remember going to the library years ago and just reading up on Michael, and it sounds like he was an interesting man. I know one article said he was an honorable citizen, so they named him as a judge. And back then, a law degree was not necessary, so I guess it was just, you know, for local stuff. So anyway, then I married a Burlington girl, Pat, and we had, I have to think about these things, 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. And Pat passed away here several years ago from cancer. I have 2 sons living in Burlington. Brian is in with the Fun City Group out there in marketing and sales. And Casey, whose birthday is today, he is now a pharmaceutical rep. My 2 daughters, one in Denver and the other in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, are school teachers, have been for many years. And my oldest, Kevin, is in Dallas, Texas with his family, and he's a sales executive for a large electronics company. So what more should I tell you? Just go on?
Well, tell us a little about your childhood, the kinds of things you did,
Yeah.
the schools you went to, etc.
Oh, so I say, we lived most of my youth up here in North Hill, and so we had a lot of fun up in North Hill with the kids. And we didn't have organized baseball then, but up in the corner of 6th and High, I think. Well, anyway, it was just a vacant lot, and that's where we played ball, which was a big deal, you know. And we had a lot of fun with that. And then I was a paper boy, so I delivered papers, of course, on the north side of town here. And I went to St. Paul's grade school, and then also went to the Catholic high school here. And I got out of high school, and I decided to go to college, and I ended up going to College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's a Jesuit institution. And people ask me why I went there. I'm still not sure to this day, but I did. And it was a great experience. And I was there for 1.5 years. And then it looked like I was going to be drafted. So several of us decided to come home and enlist in the Air Force. This was the beginning of the Korean War. So I went into the Air Force and went through basic training, and then spent almost 4 years almost in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So not much combat in Cheyenne, and that's where I spent most of my time as an instructor. I was supposed to teach people how to become teachers. I might add, I was not qualified to do that, but that was the order of the day, and you do what you're told when you're there. In my last year in the service, Pat and I were married, and then we were discharged and went to Iowa City, where I resumed my studies. And the week after I resumed studies, our first child was born. So it was kind of interesting. So I was going to school up there on the GI Bill, and in the same boat with everyone else, and really enjoyed it up there. And being a few years older than a lot of the students, it was kind of fun in a way, because I did a lot more questioning than the young people would do. You know, why is this? Are you sure? So anyway, I graduated from the University of Iowa, and I, to this day, can't give you a good explanation. People think I had this vision. Well, I didn't. But I went to work for John Winegard, a a friend of my father's introduced me to John when I was home my senior year in college. Just said, you ought to go out and meet this young guy getting started. So I did. I went out and met John Winegard. It was just something to do. And he decided that he was going to offer me a job. And I deliberated. Anyway, I decided to take the job. I'd had a number of job interviews with large national companies and assumed I'd be leaving Burlington, you know, and going someplace. But anyway, I was intrigued with this opportunity, so I accepted. And I went to work there as a rookie. And John just told me to follow him around. He was a heck of a teacher. I mean, he had the patience to, as I told him many times, you didn't realize how dumb I was, did you? And he said, you're coming along, though. So I was in the sales end of the business there and really enjoyed it. And to be in a small company and see it grow, you know, there were a lot of good people out there that made it grow. So I spent 39 years at Winegard Company. And it was a great 39 years. I mean, I've always been thankful that I was able to get established in a company like that where a lot of good values, a lot of good people. And so anyway, that's what I did. And then I retired. Yes.
Let's talk more about working for Winegard.
Okay.
First of all, what can you tell us about the early history of the Winegard Company, possibly, I assume, before you were even working there?
Well, anything I tell you along the lines before I was there would be stories that I got from John Winegard. Is when he got out of the military, when he came back to Burlington, he was working for Walter Fox down on Jefferson Street for Fox Appliance, repairing radios and phonographs and all. And television was just coming in at the time, and the nearest transmitters back then were St. Louis and Chicago. And there were people buying these TV sets and they couldn't get any pictures. And as John Winegard said, well, you got to have an antenna. So John made a couple antennas so people could use them, and sure enough, they could pick up signals from St. Louis, I think was the primary one at the time. And it wasn't the greatest picture because that's a great distance. But anyway, that's how he got started. And then people said, can you make an antenna for me? And he was making these by hand, I mean. And then he had a friend that he'd met down at Fox Appliance, said, you can come up to my basement and make stuff if you'd like. I got a workshop down there. So that's what John did. He'd make antennas, and he'd go out and sell them. And he said the money he made, he put it in a cigar box, and then he'd take his wife and others out, and they'd go out and have dinner. So, well, the word then spread, you know, around the area, and so he finally decided, he said it was a big decision for him, but to quit his job at Fox Appliance and start his own business was a frightening thing, he said, but he did it. And of course he had no regrets afterwards, but so that was in 1954, I believe, because I met John in 55, and we just had a small plant out on Kirkwood Street there, and as I say, I forget how many employees we had, but I think we had maybe 8 or 10 people in the office and then probably 20 or 30 in the factory. And of course, a lot of it, John was, many people thought John Winegard was the engineer type. Well, he was. But he also was a tremendous marketer, and people didn't know that. And that's what made John so successful, I think. He saw the whole picture. And I remember just some of the basic things he taught me that I, again, relayed then in meetings around the country, but that people don't buy what they need, they buy what they want. And I remember I'd never thought of it that way. So, well, that's true. And he said, we want to make people unhappy with what they have. We want to make them unhappy with their TV reception. We want to make them happy because if they'll buy a Winegard antenna and put it on their roof, it'll bring them better TV reception. The other thing he did, which, and again, these are basics. You tell people this today and they kind of look at you, but believe me, in our industry back then, an antenna was nothing more than a homely piece of aluminum. You never saw it on display in a retail store. You went to the TV service guy and you bought the TV, and then he said, you need an antenna. Well, how much are they? Well, you didn't see it till you had it on your roof. Well, John Winegard argued back then, and he was the only one that did back then, why can't we treat an antenna like you treat anything else that you buy? You package it properly, you finish it so it has a good look to it, and again, you make people say, gee, that looks like a good piece of equipment. Now, it's got to work. This wasn't just fun and games. Some people say, well, that was just for show. Not show by itself. I mean, this product had to work, and that's where John was a genius. I mean, his antennas did work, and that's why he had so many patents issued in his name. But one of the first things he did, color television was just coming around. And so our antennas looked great, but they were aluminum, and aluminum will oxidize when it's exposed to the air and all. And John said, you know, we ought to anodize the aluminum. Makes it a hard finish on there. It'll last for years and give better reception for more years. And in the anodizing process, we can put a color dye in there and kind of dress it up and finish it off like you would a car or anything else. So we came out with gold anodized color scepter TV antennas by Winegard. We put them in a bright yellow box with 5-color printing on them. And I can remember our competitors saying, you throw the box away. Yeah, that's true. But you know, you go to the supermarket or any place, everything's packaged, and most of it's packaged very nicely. I mean, you go into the store today, I mean, whether it's toothpaste or a can of soup, the packaging is an integral part of the consumer's point of sale. You know, how does this look? Now, granted, it can't just be looks. I'm not inferring that. But so as a young guy, I just went around the country telling this story that John Winegard taught me. And I remember going to New York and talking to some of those people out there, and of course, you know, they said, you're a farm boy from Iowa. And I said, yeah, and I'm proud of it. So what do you guys know about this? I mean, we have 2 of your major competitors in New York. And I said, well, I know exactly where they are, but they don't have what we have. And I said, we can give you a product that will sell better than theirs because we finished it, it's a better product, it's packaged, and it's advertised. So that's what we did. And I shouldn't say just me, but then we started hiring salespeople, and we went all over the country. California was one of our biggest markets. Well, I could go on and on. We better not do that. But
No, keep going.
okay. But I remember one time. I don't know if you remember Arthur Godfrey, but Arthur Godfrey was a big hit on national television, and he had the McGuire sisters on one night, and he was telling people that I wish you could see these girls in their beautiful gowns because I've got a color TV. But he said on second thought, he said, this color TV isn't what RCA says it is. He said, so I'll have to work on that. He said, the pictures just aren't that good, but I wish you could see them because they are just beautiful. Well, John Winegard or somebody heard this and it got to John. Bob Fleming, I want you to get one of our Winegard antennas and you send it to Arthur Godfrey. And you tell him we'll pay to have it put up, but he's wrong. Color TV is here and it's great. But you've got to receive enough signal. And the only way you can do that, of course, is with a good antenna. So I said, all right. I didn't think this would get very far. But so anyway, I had a Winegard color scepter antenna shipped to CBS. I think it was CBS at the time that Godfrey was with. And sent him a letter explaining what we were doing and why. And very frankly, I didn't think we'd ever hear anything. But I don't know, it was 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, some friend called, turn on to Channel 6, Godfrey's on, he's talking about Winegard. And sure enough, there was Arthur. He said, you know, this Winegard Company out in Iowa, I really owe them an apology. He said, remember one night I was telling people this color TV's no good? Well, you ought to see it now. This Winegard outfit out of Burlington, Iowa, sent me a nice antenna, they had it put up, and he said, I'm telling you, I've got pictures like you can't believe. Well, obviously, if you don't think I didn't tell that story 180 times, you know, because we held dealer meetings around the country. And then the other thing happened, RCA, of course, were the pioneers in color television with General Sarnoff and all. And so they knew, because they had engineers, they knew you needed a good antenna for that color signal to really do what it's supposed to do. So they signed on and were buying Winegard antennas under the Winegard label. And RCA back then had their own service branches around the country. I think they had 12 of them. Anyway, so they were out selling Winegard antennas. If you bought an RCA set from the RCA division, they insisted on putting a Winegard on it. And we told that story 185 times too. What an endorsement, you know, and it was a real one. And so that's how we really got going with these gold anodized antennas that were well merchandised, well packaged, and so forth. And I remember the Cleveland Plain Dealer, their major newspaper there many years ago, had a story on new status symbol in Cleveland. If you have one of those gold antennas on your roof, you must have a color TV. And again, we would parlay all this into good, you know, merchandising with our customers. So it was just fun to tell this story, and our competitors didn't know how to react to it because they were, they'd have these dealer meetings like we did, but they'd talk to the dealer about decibels and front to back ratio and horizontal beam width and the impedance match at the feed point and the tensile strength of the aluminum and so forth. And well, we talked about that too, but we spent about 1/3 of the time on that, and the rest of it was we're going to show you guys how to sell this. And I remember Hal Sorensen, a local Burlington guy who worked for us. He was an advertising guy. He said, why don't we start displaying antennas? Well, an antenna was a pretty big thing. I mean, and a lot of these stores and service shops weren't that big. So we came up with a miniature antenna. We made sure the public knew it was miniature. It'd be bigger when they got it. But we put it on a gold anodized display pole. So we could go into a dealer's store. We could put it from the floor up with spring loaded, or we could put it from the countertop up. And we put that little miniature gold anodized Winegard antenna on there. We were running ads in Life magazine then. Now we couldn't run full page ads nationally, but we had ads in there occasionally. So we had the Life tags on the antennas, and then our name, of course. And the dealers would say, well, that looks nice, but I've got an antenna I can buy from ABC Company, and it's half the price. And I said, I understand that. I said, we're not telling you can't sell that antenna, but we're saying, why don't you give the consumer a choice? What do you mean? Well, you're a consumer. When you go out to buy test equipment in your service shop, you just go to one place. Don't you check on the different manufacturers to see what you think they have that might satisfy your needs better than the other? You look at price, quality, appearance. Well, antennas, why can't they be the same? And if the consumer comes into your store and says he wants that cheap plain aluminum one in the back, you have every right to sell it to him. But why don't you show them that gold one? They might look at it and say, boy, that looks better. So guess what? It took some selling. But over the years, we did this, and we really were the #1 antenna guy in the country as far as merchandising TV antennas. Out of that, then, of course, came the additional products that followed that. We got into amplifiers to boost the signal. We got into couplers and splitters. We got into what they call master antenna system amplifiers, so you could send the signal through a hotel or a school or what have you. I remember one night, John Winegard said, I think we're going to start making couplers. Now, keep in mind, I was not an engineer. My degree was in marketing and business. But John said, don't worry, I'll handle that end of it. But he said, we're going to start making couplers. Well, to me, this was a big deal. Well, if you look at the day, it was a plastic box with a little circuit board in there. But out of that grew more complex amplifiers, and we had some of the most modern manufacturing approaches that came into that with wave soldering and all this stuff. So we kept expanding that line, still building it on the same story and the same threshold that Winegard is quality, and Winegard believes in the consumer. We want to give that consumer what he wants. We had Paul Harvey doing some advertising with us one time, and I'll never forget, Harvey always said that he would not advertise a product unless he personally knew the people and knew about it, and I'm sure you've heard that. So Paul Harvey did come to Burlington. I'll never forget, John and I went out to meet him at the airport, and of course Harvey was a great salesman, and there were other people from the local station where they were trying to glad hand with him, but Harvey said, where's John Winegard? That's the man he wanted to see. So anyway, Harvey met John, and we had lunch together and toured the plant and what have you. But it was fun. It was a fun thing to do. And there again, we merchandised that, that Paul Harvey sells Winegard, The advertising was a big thing. Again, you have to remember that a TV antenna, again, was a pretty homely product until John Winegard came along. So when we started advertising in Better Homes and Gardens and Look and Life and so forth, and then we had dealer co-op funds available. Now other competitors gradually followed. But when you're in the lead, it's hard to catch. And that's what made us good. We then had opportunities. The word spread, by the way, and we had some good customers in Europe, South America, Australia, New Zealand. Now, that was never a big part of the business, but it certainly was worthwhile. And I remember one day John Winegard walked in and said, hey, Bob, let's go to Europe. And that's how John would do things. I said, oh, where? Well, I don't care, let's just go. Well, when do you want to go? Bob, why don't you put something together? Well, I'd never been to Europe, and I was pretty young and all, but I thought, well, if he wants to go to Europe and take me with him, why not go? So we did, and I set up this trip, and I worked with the United States Department of Commerce to get some advice from them, and so we set up this trip, and I took it into John Winegard and said, well, here's the itinerary. What do you think? He said, looks good to me. He hardly even looked at it. Let's go, you know. So we flew to Europe, and that's where, again, I think I got a good chance to know John even better, because the two of us were together for 2 weeks, day and night over there. And we saw some very interesting things in Europe, as anybody would. We had a chance to meet a few of the customers that we had done business with, and that was fun to meet these people that we'd talked to them, but we'd never met them. So we had that good experience. Well, again, I could talk for hours about all the things we did there, but as I say, I remember when I retired, I was ready to retire. I mean, I've been there a long time, and everybody kept saying, gee, you ought to enjoy retirement. And I said, well, yeah, and I think I will. But John was a very interesting man, and I say I owed him so much, because he gave me an opportunity and then taught me. And I was so flattered that when he passed away a few years ago, his family asked me to give the eulogy at his funeral. And it was hard to do, but I was so proud to do it, you know, because I was so proud of him, you know. So anyway, it's just been a great experience for me. I might add, when I retired, my wife had come down with cancer. And she was doing pretty well, but we thought this was a time to enjoy life, and we went to Florida and spent some time and what have you. And but I remember then, after she passed away, although I have since remarried, I'm happy to say, but then in recent years it was, now what am I going to do? And I went back to Winegard. I went in to see Randy Winegard one day, who's a great guy, and I said, Randy, I said, I think I want to come back and do something part-time. And of course he said, are you kidding? And I said, no. I said, I want to keep busy. Is there anything I could do? He said, like what? I said, I don't know. And keep in mind, I'd been out of the company then about 9 years. He called me the next day, and to make a long story longer, he had a couple young people upstairs that he really was high on. He said, they're really bright people. But he said, I think some mentoring from a veteran like you might be appropriate. So I did that for 3 years, up until last August. And was that fun? Because these were bright young people. They knew a lot more than they realized. And I wasn't as smart as they thought I was, but they didn't know that. But anyway, so it was fun to be back. And of course, Randy then running the company, and all new people, basically. So again, it was a refreshing thing, and there you go. John Winegard, I got involved with the city council back in 1968. We were going to change the form of government, and I got talked into running. And again, it was people like John Winegard who urged me to do it, and I knew I'd be taking time off work. He said, that's fine, but we need people, you know, to come in and serve the community. So I got involved in that, and I've been involved in a lot of things since then. But I know John Winegard, by the way, just several years ago, I was retired, but Randy called me, and the Consumer Electronics Association, which represents all the big electronics companies, the Zeniths and the RCAs. Well, they honor certain people, and that year they were going to honor John Winegard, and together with him were people like Hewlett and Packard of HP. I mean, these were big names. The chairman of the board of Toshiba Corporation. Anyway, Randy wasn't able to go and asked if I'd go in his place. And again, I didn't feel I should. I mean, but he insisted, so I did. And again, it was another honor for me to be there to be the recipient in the name of John Winegard, who had passed away by then. But, so as you can tell, I got a lot of stories to tell. But I think, when I think about all those years at Winegard and the city council, and I was involved with Badco and the chamber and all those things, Burlington's my town. I mean, I happen to like it here, and you know, there's some people I know that complain it's not big enough, it's not smart enough, it's not this. It's not perfect, but what is? And I think you have to find yourself in a place. And all I know, maybe the fact that I traveled for so many years. I traveled all over the country and in many parts of the world, saw a lot of great things. But the more I did that, the more I realized I've got a gem right here in Burlington, Iowa. So that's the history, if you will. Now, what else should we talk about?
One more question about
Oh,
John Winegard
yeah.
and the antenna.
Mm-hmm.
Did he actually invent the antenna? Is he considered to be the inventor?
No. There were other people that had designed and made antennas. But he took designs and modified them to be unique and very effective, and that's why he was granted patents. But no, he was not the first person to design a TV antenna. One of the first persons was a Dr. Yagi in Japan that designed some types of antennas. But John took some of those theories and then he expanded and improved upon them. For instance, with Dr. Yagi, when he was designing antennas a little before then, they were for 1 and 2 channels. You point it this way and there's channel 4 and 6. Well, when we got into the business, or when John got into it, it was an all-channel market. Now it was VHF, but it was channels 2 to 13. So you had to have one single antenna that could cover all those frequencies. And then not too many years later, the UHF spectrum came along. So now you needed an antenna that worked channels 2 to 13, and as well as 14 to 82. So that took some real engineering. And there's, again, where John was brilliant. I mean, the other thing John did too, which always impressed me, John was out in the factory a great deal. He knew his people. I mean, he was one of these guys that he was just down to earth. I mean, and he had great sense for people. I mean, I know we had people that had handicaps and what have you. He was happy to hire them, not because it was good. They were good people. Why not give them a shot, you know? And he had great knowledge in the factory. I mean, he was the engineer, but he also was the marketer. He also was a production guy. I mean, he could go out and show you how to set up a rivet machine or a punch press. I mean, he just had a feel for the whole thing. So it was, again, it was fun to see him. And I know years later I'd have people that I'd run into and they say, oh, remember John coming out the plant to see us? I said, I do remember that. He always did that. He was just very approachable to everybody, you know. A lot of fond memories. My dad worked at the Leopold Company for years. He was a sales executive there, worked for Carl Leopold, well, and then later Fred. And he was a great inspiration to me. He was, I always said, a pretty sharp guy. And he really loved Burlington, and he loved the Leopold Company. And they sold executive wood office furniture all around the United States. And I remember when I started traveling for Winegard, I'd go into some of these places, and if they had a good-looking desk, I'd always open the drawer to see if the Leopold sign was there. My dad got a kick out of that. So anyway, I remember with the folks, again, I have a lot of fond childhood memories. I mean, going, you know, picnics out at State Park and going out in the river, and of course, my grandparents were special people. I'm jumping around here now, but my granddad Finnegan was a conductor on the CB&Q Railroad, and oh, I thought so much of him. And my grandmother, we called her Gammy Finnegan, she was just a lovely person. They lived on the corner of Garfield and Division. Used to love to go over there. And Granddad many times would take me downtown. Of course, we walked. But he always had a belt with him because he was taking books back to the library. And he used to preach to me. I was his oldest grandson, his first grandson. You've got to read, young man, you got to read. And I'd carry those, I can still remember carrying those books, and we'd go down to the Burlington Public Library. And he'd go in there, and sure enough, he'd turn those books in and pick up 4 or 5 more, and I can see we'd strap that up with the belt. Now, sometimes going back up the hill, he'd help me and he'd carry him. And we'd go into Canella's Barbershop and some of those places in old Burlington. But it was just so much fun. And he was always trying to teach me something. One day he said, I want you to learn the capitals of the 48 states. Gee, you know, I don't remember how old I was, but well, by golly, we got it done. And he loved it. We'd go over there on a Sunday with the family, and I can still hear it grin. All right, everybody be quiet. Bobby, get over here. All right, Illinois, Springfield, you know. Wyoming, Cheyenne, and boy, I better get them all because he'd scold me if I didn't. And then my granddad Fleming worked at the bank, and his oldest brother was John J. Fleming. And he was just a fun man to be with, and he was always interested in what I was doing as a young person, and I used to love to go over there. And my grandmother Fleming, well, like my grandmother Finnegan, loved to make things that kids liked. Like I remember rhubarb pie and the homemade cookies and some of that stuff. But I've often thought now, my kids all left Burlington, the ones that have children, so they haven't had that same opportunity that I had. I mean, grandparents, as you know, are so special, and the fact that we had ours right here, you know, is pretty nice. I can just think of it. We used to go over on the Flemings lived over next to the Grace M.E. Church. It's a parking lot now, 559 South Central. And it was fun. Of course, back then, going over there was like a big trip. I mean, going on the south end of town. But like in the winter, we go over there on the weekend, and they let us slide down the Angular Street Hill. And oh man, we thought that was something. So anyway, a lot of fond memories. And of course, when Granddad was going out on the road with the train, sometimes we'd go down to the depot and watch him, and he'd be, because he was the one that ran that train, like the conductors, and he'd say, all right, aboard, and it was time to go off wherever they were going.
Is that when it was the old depot still?
The old depot, oh yes, the old depot. And we had 3 or 4 Zephyrs going through Burlington then, I remember the Nebraska Zephyr, the Denver, the California, the Oxnard Bend. And the thing I think impressed me too, maybe I'm easily impressed, but Granddad Finnegan as an example, I think was very proud of his job. His uniform was always spotless. And I remember that brass or that plate on his cap, I mean, that thing was polished like you wouldn't believe it. And that taught me something. I mean, he was proud of what he was doing, and that's why he did it so well. Because I guess my dad used to travel a lot by rail, and he said, oh, everybody knew Jack Finnegan, And so anyway, those are all fond memories. And I remember when Aunt Molly, well, John, of course, Uncle John had passed away. Aunt Molly lived right over here on North 7th Street. And she had, her oldest son, Philip, was a Major General in the United States Army. In fact, some people give him some credit for getting the funds for the Memorial Auditorium. But when Philip would come to Burlington, he'd always call my dad. And anyway, my brother Terry and I would go over there. And of course, to see the general was a big deal, And he always had a couple of aides with him, and they'd have a telephone in case he had to call to Washington. I remember we thought that was the biggest thing in the world. And during World War II, a lot of people, and my Aunt Molly was no exception, had the flag in the window, with the stars. And I forget how many stars she had, but she had more kids and relatives in the military. Many of them through West Point and Annapolis and all. But so that was interesting too.
Just FYI, Philip Fleming was on the cabinet of 2 presidents.
That's right. That's right. I'll never forget, this is another story that maybe isn't appropriate, but I'm going to tell it anyway. We'd gone to Colorado on vacation, my brother and I, and mother and dad, and one of the Fleming girls married a man who was the commanding officer of Fort Carson in Colorado Springs. And anyway, we went down there to see the Blunts, and I didn't even know who they were really, but it was kind of fun. But then they said, coincidentally, that General Fleming's going to be here. Wow, Dad said, well, that'll be great to see Phil, too. What a coincidence. So anyway, we toured, then we went to the Officers Club, and that's where Phil was. And of course, they're all waiting on him, Well, anyway, we're seated, and it was just my mother and Mrs. Blunt, I forget her name now, but then all the men, And anyway, the waiter comes, and we're all sitting there, and the waiter goes to the general. What will the general like? And my dad, you'd have to know my dad. Where I come from, you serve the women first. And Philip said, that is correct. And boy, this waiter went right around and waited on my mother. And mother was so embarrassed. But I was a youngster, but I remember that. And I thought, that's class. I mean, there's a value there or something. And Philip was the first to agree. The military, they're not used to that, but it was kind of an interesting deal. What else can I tell you?
Let's go back to your childhood for a little bit. What did you talked about some of the things you did outdoors. What did you do on a rainy day?
On a rainy day? Well, one thing we did, the Rowan family lived right down here on Snake Alley. And Mr. Rowan was a chauffeur for Mrs. Eastman. And I went to school with the Rowan kids. And so many times, sunny and rainy, though, we'd go down there, and Mrs. Rowan was a great cook, and she'd bake. You could just smell it all over the neighborhood. But then, if we behaved ourselves, like on a rainy day, we'd go over to Mrs. Eastman's, to the garage. And Mr. Rowan was always there watching. He said, boys, you got to be careful. But then she had 2 or 3 Packard automobiles, and I can remember, and he kept those just spotless, And we'd just hang around there and look around. We thought that was really neat. We never did see Mrs. Eastman, but we saw the cars and all that. And then, I got in trouble with this, but one time we got bored and it wasn't rainy, but we went over on the bridge and we thought it'd be fun to jump into those coal piles that were underneath. And we did that, and we didn't get in trouble till we got home, and our parents saw how dirty we were. I mean, good Lord, you can't imagine. But it was silly stuff. We rode our bicycles every place. I mean, you know, biking around was fun. And how many times could you go up Snake Alley, you know? And so those are just happy things that I can't think of anything else, but just.
Do you remember your family being affected by the Depression?
Yes, in fact, I don't remember a lot. I know this, we didn't have an automobile. And I know I've told my children that, and they go, really? I said, no, we didn't have a car. And I remember we finally got one, and we thought this was a pretty big deal. And it wasn't a new one, but it was a car. Because I know we begged Dad then, can we take a ride? And this is when there were just 2 or 3 of us. But anyway, we'd pile in that car, and we'd just drive around town. And so, no, Mother and Dad shopped at Louis Kipper's grocery store up here on North 6th Street. And, you know, we lived very modestly, and yet I never felt we were deprived. I mean, Mother and Dad were always up. I mean, they were never going around. And if they had problems, they didn't show it to us, you know. They always just seemed. The other thing back then, too, that I remember, and we don't do it much anymore, I can remember friends of theirs stopping by the house. You know, just stopping, hey, how you doing? What's going on, you know? Maybe they come by in the evening hours, or maybe, well, why don't you stay and have a sandwich with us or something? And I thought that was neat. I mean, now granted, these were people, my seniors, but they were people I knew because they were friends of my parents. Today, you don't see much of that. I mean, if you're going to have someone over, you invite them, and you got to get the house clean, you know, and that. It was more casual, and that was always fun. Then I remember another thing. Mother and Dad used to have a annual Christmas party, and what made it unique, they invited their parents. It was one generation, and they invited their friends, and then Terry and I, the 2 older, we could invite some of our friends. So you had those 3 generations, if you will. And my dad, by the way, was a great cook, and he did most of the cooking. And by the way, his mother would say, I'm a good cook also. We'd say, yes, Mother. But it was unusual that the dad liked to cook. And he'd put on a spread with Mother's help for the Christmas party. But being there with the older people to us was a pretty neat experience. So that's one of those memories. And then again, the picnics in the summer, going out to State Park and with the grandparents and the kids, and just happy, happy, happy.
When you say going out to State Park, where are you talking about?
Out by Flint Hills, Flint Hills Golf Course out there. That used to be called State Park. Somebody else just asked me that. They said, where's State Park? And I said, well, I know we went out there, but Flint Hills and up the hill there, and there was nothing there really, but I remember we'd build a fire and cook hot dogs and hamburgers and maybe take some balls and play ball out there. And my parents and their friends used to go out there at night and party, you know. So anyway, it was fun, and I went to St. Paul's Church down here. I'm still emotionally attached to that. And I was an altar boy down there, and we went to church every Sunday and enjoyed it. And
do you remember, I guess, anything about World War II, from Pearl Harbor to during the war, the rationing, the end of the war, VE Day, VJ Day, all of that?
yeah, I certainly remember the impact it had on our country. One thing I do remember, a friend of mine, his dad was a salesman of this area. He drove his car. Well, they had the gas rationing then, and he blacked out his back windows, and that qualified him for a different class where he got more gas, if you will, because he converted the car, if you will, into a business type thing. And with the gas rationing, I remember that very well, because like we did have a car then, and I can't remember exactly when, but we didn't go out in it very much because gas was rationed, you know. I was carrying papers the day of Pearl Harbor, and I remember everybody yelling and screaming, and I wasn't sure what was going on. But and then further into the war, I knew some guys that went into the war and didn't come back. They were older than I, but I sure knew who they were. And used to think a lot about that, you know, and what those guys are doing, and gals, I guess, but over in Europe and all the bombing raids and so forth. And ooh, my. That's why when people ask me if I served in the military, I always say, well, yeah, in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Not much going on out there. And then, of course, I remember the celebration at the end of the war. I mean, you know, what a happy day for all of us. I mean, I don't remember doing anything special as a young person, but I sure remember it. I mean, and I remember all the women in the world that were going to work in the factories back then to make the jeeps and the tanks and artillery gear and all, to support the men that were over there. I mean, that's a great story. That history is something. I wish I were more of a history buff and had studied more of it.
Did your mother go to work?
No, I don't think she did. No, I don't think she did.
Do you know any of the plants around here? I know that a number of the plants did participate in the war effort and make things for the military. Do you know about any of those?
No. Sorry.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
Do you remember, and you've probably been pretty young, you mentioned earlier Memorial Auditorium. Do you remember when that was built?
Vaguely. I do remember the fire, though, at the old depot. God, that was terrible. But no, I don't know what year that was when that was built, but I don't remember that, no.
What do you remember about the fire at the depot, the old depot?
Well, I think the fact that my granddad Finnegan was a conductor, you know, so I had that kind of a feeling for the railroad, if you will. And evidently, I think I must have felt that it was going to injure or hurt my grandfather, because I felt bad about it, you know, maybe more so than most kids would at that time. But I think it was because Granddad worked down there, if you will, and it was a fine old building, you know. But I just remember the fire, and oh yeah, this was a big thing, you know.
Do you remember when they built the new depot?
Yes, yeah, that was pretty fancy. That was a big investment for this town, you know. And now here we are trying to put it to use again, but. No, and of course, people have asked me what it was like when I worked at Winegard as far as the town. And, you know, out there, Roosevelt Avenue was nothing. I mean, right behind our Winegard factory, the initial building, was a cornfield. I mean, right there. I mean, and it was, God, I just think about that, and it's hard to believe. I mean, I've told young people that, and they say, are you kidding? I said, no, this wasn't all out here, you know. And then that's when they say, boy, you are old, aren't you? I said, now, come on.
Did you go to the fair when you were a kid?
Oh, yes. Oh, no, yes. Oh, yes. No, that was always a treat. Yep, went to the fair. Loved to go out. I remember when, maybe it was the circus and the fair, but I remember years ago, they'd bring some of the animals on rail down here on Front Street. And then they'd march the elephants and all up to Jefferson and all the way out to the old fairgrounds. And oh, my, we thought that was neat. That was a pretty exciting deal, you know. And yeah, we'd walk all the way out there, just follow the animals, you know. That to us was more fun maybe than being out there for the actual show, if you will, but because watching them unload down here at the depot, or not depot, but down on Front Street there. And then, of course, the other thing I remember, the Streckfus steamboats that came up here, excursion boats. And some friends of my mother and dad's were related to the Streckfus family. And not that that means anything other than we sure got first-class treatment when we got on those things. Because the kids could go on in the afternoon, you know, and we thought that was something. And then my parents would go out in the evening then also, you know. And those are, that riverfront with those big, we thought they were big anyway, boats coming in there. That was a pretty happy time, really.
How often did excursion boats stop here in summer?
Oh, Mary, I really don't know. I imagine 3 or 4 times. Now, that's just a guess. I really don't know. All I know, when they were there, I was there. I mean, boy, that was a special treat, you know. was fun.
Do you remember the names of them?
There was the Capitol, I think was one. There was the JC, I think, or the JS Streckbus. And those are the only two I remember. My memory isn't so good. But these are all fond memories, you know.
What other bigger events do you remember from your younger days? Some people have mentioned the Toby and Susie shows. Did you go to those?
I didn't go to those. I was aware of them and all, but for whatever reason, I didn't get into that. Nope. I'm trying to think what else I did.
And how about the Burlington baseball team? Did you go to watch?
Oh yeah, we go to did do that, yeah. My dad was a big baseball fan, and so he'd take us to the ball games. And then, of course, not often, but occasionally, again, this is when Terry and I were the two older, and he would take us to Chicago, spend a weekend. Oh, and then we go to Wrigley Field to see the Cubs play. And I'll never forget the first time he took us there. And we were really excited because Terry and I were not big baseball fans, although my brother Terry would say he is a Cub fan today, and he always has been. But it was just the excitement of going with Dad, the train, going all the way to Chicago, staying in a hotel downtown, seeing all the big buildings. So the game was fun, but I'll never forget, so we get there, and at the end of the game, I said, well, let's go, Dad. We want to see, boy, it's just a double header. And the two of us went, oh, no. I think my dad was very disappointed in his sons because he and his father, Bill Fleming, would just love baseball. I can remember him sitting on that porch on South Central with that radio, listening to those games, hour after hour. But we made several trips to Chicago, and oh boy, I remember I was in high school. He took us over for the All-Star football game, which used to be played at Dyke Stadium at Northwestern. And as a kid, I thought that was really something. And you didn't get to do that very often. And then occasionally, not often, but he would take a couple of us up to Iowa City for the Hawkeye football games. And that was neat. And I've been a Hawkeye fan all my life. My 5 kids all graduated from Iowa. And so as I say, just a lot of happy times. I mean,
Another baseball question. I haven't asked anybody else this, and I've often wondered, they always talk about the Negro Leagues and the great baseball players, Satchel Paige, et cetera. Did any of those games ever get played here?
I don't know. That's all I can tell. I really don't know. I wasn't aware if they were. Could have been, but nope, I don't know.
The first steamboat days.
Oh, I remember that. Because I worked on that, and then I was a co-chairman for the third one. And that was exciting. That was a lot of fun.
Tell us about that first one.
Well, I was just on the committee with 100 other people, but I remember out selling tickets, and it was a pretty big deal, though, for Burlington, and there were a lot of skeptics, can you really pull this off, and of course, we were young, and hey, why not? Let's go out and do it, and I can't remember precisely who we had that first year, but all I know,
I think it was Al Gert, wasn't it?
it might have been. And then one year, it was the second year when Louis Armstrong was here, when all the bugs and all, and we had to go into the auditorium. But we had Miss Never Sail down there. Remember, it blew over one year. But Steamboat Days, I think, was great because it brought the community together. I mean, it gave, I think, a sense of pride. It took a lot of people to make it happen. It wasn't just a committee of 5 or 6 people. So with that involvement, it made it successful, And, I still go now. I mean, that's not always my choice as far as the music, but what the heck. It appeals to a lot of people. And it's just fun, I think, to go down and see the people, And again, it's one of those positives we have in this town that a lot of towns don't have. Of course, I go down to West Point for their sweet corn deal. I love corn. That's always fun. I used to take the kids down to the fire station. I always thought that was a big deal on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, but occasionally go down there. And One time we were down there and the alarm went off and the guys came down the pole. Listen, I'll tell you, I wish you, well, I was excited as my boys were, wow, the way they went. And then I remember, well, this is years later, I'm jumping around now, but when they were working up at the Mercy Hospital and that gas line ruptured, and I was on the city council then because we all came down to City Hall and yeah, there were fire trucks running all over and nobody had any idea how big this might be, And I remember trucks coming in from Illinois and southern Iowa, and I'll never forget, I'm standing down there at the fire station, and this one truck comes wheeling in, and some guy yells to him, go up the hill to South 8th Street or something. And this truck goes up the hill, gets about halfway up the hill and stops. He has no idea where he's going. I mean, wasn't familiar. So they sent a police car up to tell him where to go. But that was a frightening day because most people back then had gas cookware, or stoves, and those pilot things were. And as you probably or you may remember, there was very little damage done, thank goodness. But that was pretty exciting.
Do you remember when that was?
Well, I was on the council from 68 to 70, so it was in that time frame. I can't tell you precisely, but.
Do you remember when the grain elevator?
Yes. In fact, I was at the office and I heard about it and I drove down. They couldn't get that close, but I just couldn't believe it. That was terrible. Of course, we were way out in the west edge of town, so we didn't see or hear anything until you came downtown. But yep.
Do me a favor, and on those last couple of things, like, okay, the grain elevator, restate that and actually use the words grain elevator.
Oh, yeah.
For the sake of the.
Yeah, well, I forget the date, but when we were in the office and we actually heard the explosion and we didn't know what it was. Well, someone had a radio and they said it's the grain elevator down on the Mississippi River. And being a curious soul, I got in my car and drove down there to see what I could see. And it was a terrible explosion. And people that were down there in that area said you couldn't believe it. Windows were knocked out of buildings and so forth. So it was a pretty bad deal. I mean,
Do you remember when you or your family got your first TV, or the first TV that you ever saw?
the first TV I ever saw was my mother and dad's. Dad brought home a TV. I can't remember when. I was in high school. But because I can remember before that, we listened to the radio, and there were certain programs I remember that we listened to that religiously, like you watch TV shows now. But no, I remember when Dad brought home the TV, we thought that was a pretty big deal. And of course, that was way before my Winegard days. So, but oh yeah. And then I remember not too many years after that when we got our color TV. And we thought that was really, a big deal. And I remember we were frustrated because not all programs were in color. You might see color from 7 to 8 o'clock, and then the next program was black and white. But it was fun to see that evolution of product as it, came down the line. And then to think I ended up in the middle of that business. So it was fun.
What programs did you listen to on the radio, and then what programs did you watch on TV in the early days?
I'm trying to think, on the radio, because my dad was always listening to it. Fibber McGee and Molly, we used to listen to Fibber McGee and Molly. And was there One Man's Family, I think, or something like that. And Wade the Piper Hudson, I'm trying to remember. Those are the only two I can remember. There were more, though, that I know we watched religiously. And then early on, of course, when we first got into television, of course, I think, in high school then, and I was pretty busy with other activities. So I really wasn't a regular TV viewer then. I can't recall, in other words, saying I'm going to see a particular show. Or I had discovered girls at that time and sports and fun. And so, my dad got me a car. It was a 1931 Ford Model A. This would have been in 46. So it was an old car when I got it. But to have a car. And there were just a couple rules. I could have the car and drive it at my leisure. I had to be on the honor roll. and no tickets of any kind. And any discrepancies in those two issues, the car's gone. And those were the rules. So I abided by the rules because it was very important for me to have that car. I remember one night, this probably isn't appropriate for this, but I mentioned the folks going on picnics. One time that Joe Rowan, a friend of mine, and I were in the car, and he said, you know, Bob, this thing's getting kind of tacky inside. Why don't we get some blankets and kind of upholster the thing? And I said, well, we got some blankets at home. So I asked my mother if I could grab a blanket. We were going to do the front seat. And she said, sure, grab that gray one over there. And I did. What I didn't tell her, I didn't realize, or she didn't, we took it and cut it and stapled it, and we really upholstered it. It really looked nice, and we thought we had really done a good job. And I think maybe several weeks passed, and I remember it was in the summer, and we're parked out in front there, and Dad was loading the car. They were going to State Park for a picnic. And Mother yelled out, Bob, get that blanket out of Bobby's car, will you please? We're going to take that with us. And Dad said, sure. Bob, get the blanket out of the car. I didn't know what to do. Dad, come here. I was in trouble. He said, you're going to have to go in and tell your mother what you did to her blanket. But anyway, I remember having a car was a fun thing, you know, an old Model A Ford.
When did automobiles start having signal lights?
Oh, God.
Did the 31 Ford?
Oh, Lord, no. No.
So how did you let people know?
You put your hand straight out if you're going to go to the left, and if you're going to the right, you did this. And that's how you signal people that you were turning, you know. Of course, in that Model A Ford, it had a spark adjustment on it and a hand clutch. But to me, that car was about as classy as it had to be. That was fine. I mean, any car back then, you know, was a treat to have. But I really had to study. I had to stay on that honor roll, and I had to behave myself as far as driving around town. So that was fun.
About music, what were your music preferences at various times in your life?
Oh, that's kind of interesting. My mother loved music, and I'd say more along the semi-classical side. And I became interested in it, and she thought that was neat that one of the boys might show some interest. And then I liked a lot of popular stuff too. I remember Mother and I loved Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians, that choral group, you know, and they were great. And I'm trying to think what else. But I know we had records, and Mother and I sometimes would just spend an afternoon and play music, you know. And then over the years, I've always enjoyed music. I'm not a student of it, but I know when I was at Holy Cross, I was in the Glee Club for a year, and that was fun. And I just love to hear good choirs and choral groups, you know, like the Bel Canto here in Burlington. Monday night of this week at St. Paul's, Central College had their a cappella choir down, which was just outstanding. Augustana College had their group down here a month or two ago at Bethany Lutheran, and it was outstanding. So I love choral music especially.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, and most of the guys out there were from the East, obviously, especially New England and New York and all. And this was the Jesuit school, and the Jesuits believed in discipline. And again, I've told my kids these stories, and they shake their head and think, how stupid can you be? But, you know, the respect we had to show for the professors when they entered that room, you stood immediately. And you look at kids today, and some of that, it's changed, let's put it that way. But you carried a heavy load. You weren't allowed out during the week, except weekends. And only then, if the dean of discipline thought you would behave during the week. So that was a big experience for me. And it was a good experience, but it was difficult. I was homesick. That's another story I'll tell you. I still laugh about it. I'd write these letters home to my mother and dad and tell them I missed them, and I'm doing all right, but boy, I really miss you, and I miss this, and I miss that, and on and on and on, you know. Well, my mother would get all upset. Bob, we shouldn't have sent him out there. I mean, he's 1,000 miles. And one day she said, you call out there and you talk to those Jesuits and have them check on Bobby and see how he's doing. So Dad laughed when he told me the story. Anyway, so he called out there and he talked to Father O'Reilly or somebody. Said, I'm Bob Fleming from Burlington, Iowa. My son's out here, a freshman at Holy Cross. And let me look him up. Yeah, we've got him here, yep. Well, my wife's upset because he's writing these letters and he's homesick. Is he homesick? And he said, oh yeah, he's very homesick. Mr. Fleming, what a compliment. He said, that means one thing. That boy came from a family, a mother and a father that loved him and showed that love. And you should be complimented for that. That's the highest compliment he can pay you. Dad said, I was just, oh, well, thank you very much. So Mother said, well, what did he say? So Dad repeated with the, Mother said, oh, now that's ridiculous. Dad said, well, think about it, Mary. Maybe it isn't. But anyways, I adjusted like anybody would, and so it was fun later on, but it was a different experience, And because I remember the same thing then when we were married and my kids started going away to school. They all went to Iowa City, and I remember the first semester for each one of them, especially the girls, they were home almost every weekend, which was fine. Second semester, maybe every other weekend. And the second year, we're pleading with them to come home and see us. By the time they were seniors, we had to go up and see them. So that's a natural evolution, I think, that we all go through as parents. But anyway, that was fun. But I can still hear my dad telling that story about taking care of his homesick. It was a riot.
Did you go to the movies when you were a kid?
Yes, we went to the Palace Theater, we went to the Arion, and then I remember the Zephyr Theater down on Jefferson. They had cowboy things and all those cereals on Saturdays. Oh man, we thought that was great. If we had been good that week, Mother or Dad would give us a quarter and we could go down and buy a ticket and have a pop and some popcorn and watch a double feature, and that was always fun. I still enjoy movies to this day, but as a kid, oh yeah, that was, and a lot of times on Sunday, we go down there in the school year and go to an afternoon matinee. Then at the end of the matinee, I can remember as a youngster thinking, tomorrow's school, though, so you always had that. But anyway, it was fun. We had a good time. And the Arion Theater at one time. And then I remember going out to the park luncheonette out there at the end of Main Street. And a lot of neat places around here,
Tell about the park luncheonette.
Well, I don't know what to say about it. It was a building right out there as you enter Crapel Park off of Main Street. And you could eat out there and so forth. And you had a view, of course, of the river, and you're right next to the park. So it was kind of a unique place to go for Burlington. And I don't know, it was fun. I remember my folks used to go out there frequently with their friends, on a Saturday night and have a party out there and that type of thing. And of course, I always thought the parks of Burlington, I mean, I can remember as a youngster going out to Crapel Park with a bunch of us and playing on the slides and all. I mean, that to us was a real treat. And then going over on the east side by the old cabin there and the what do you call it? Anyway, those big cannons, I can't think of the word. But looking at those and looking at the river, I mean, that was all part of growing up in this town. I still enjoy looking at the river in that park. I mean, I drove through it just several days ago.
The park luncheonette, isn't that where McCorn always lived?
Yes, that's right. I can tell you, well, that was a funny story. We lived up on the end of Spring Street in later years and had a great view of the river and all. And back then we didn't lock the front door. And one morning I heard Dad, because my brother and I were awake, but he said, you boys stay in your room, we got a little problem here. And I had to call the police. Dad always got up first. Well, he went downstairs and there was some guy laying on the couch in our living room. And of course, Dad had no idea who he was. So he correctly called the police. The police come up, and of course, Terry and I weren't allowed, but we could look out the front window and we see these cops, and they come in there, and they come in very carefully, and they look, and they say, oh, that's Augie. He must have gotten drunk again last night. They put their guns away, and this guy would go across the river and get inebriated, and then he'd tell him he lived on Spring Street, but he wouldn't explain to the cab that it was West Burlington. So they dumped him at our house. And this is not funny, but we kids thought it was funny at the time. My mother was very upset because this was her Duncan Fife couch. I guess that's a style of some kind. And our friend happened to urinate on the couch. My mother was furious. And Dad was upset because she made him pay to have the thing completely redone and reupholstered. But of course, to Terry and I forget how old we were, probably, I don't know, 10 or 12. But, oh, we just thought this, of course, and then we had to tell everybody in town about it, you know. But those are funny stories growing up, you know, in town that are just. Another time we were making parachutes. I forget what we were making. We were throwing up in the air. Anyway, they got caught in the tree. And again, we were at the end of Spring Street looking over the bluff. So I'm standing out there throwing rocks, trying to knock this thing down, not realizing those rocks are going over the bluff and down to Highway 99. And of course, I evidently hit a car or two because, and I have no idea this is happening, you know, not thinking. So anyway, somebody called the police, and they come running up there. And anyway, we were not incarcerated, but we were lectured to. You don't throw rocks over the bluff. But those are things that kids do, you know. I'm trying to think of other stories, but I'm not. Well, one other story, my grandfather Finnegan did give me an old BB gun. I mean, it really was old, and it was nothing to it. And my brother Terry and I were out in the front yard one day, and I said, put on that suede jacket, and then I was shooting him, and it didn't even, we thought it was funny, you know, bang, bang. Well, my mother came out and saw us. Well, she thought, of course, I was filling his body with BBs, and that's a dumb story, but those are the funny things you do as a kid, and you remember that. You look back, you know. And so again, I think I'm very blessed to have those memories. I mean, you know, memories you can do a lot with, and I was blessed to have great parents and great grandparents, and now I've got good kids and a good wife, and I'm a very thankful guy, let's put it that way. I'm going to run for city council now again. And anyway, people are saying, why are you going to do that? Well, I did it once before, so I know something about it. But again, it's that thing about, I don't have any hobbies, I guess, where I can sit at home, and I want to be active. And I really like this town. And I figure guys like me ought to do this. So I don't have any agenda or I'm not mad at anybody. It's just I'm going to run for it, and if elected, I'll serve and hopefully do a good job. End of commercial. Ta-da.
Good.
Okay.